U.S. History, Lesson 22, Reconstruction. Our previous lesson dealt with the Civil War, and as we talked about ending our previous lesson, which is something which I'm sure has come up in your courses, the phrase, wars don't always solve new problems or old problems, sometimes they create new ones. Nothing evidences that more than the struggles that have to take place after the Civil War. In many ways, for the Union at least, or for both sides, fighting the Civil War, the actual combat, was a relatively straightforward proposition. That was almost the easy part in comparison, and it wasn't easy, but in comparison to the agony and difficulties and enormous problems that are going to come about as actors from all sides try to sort of put this country back together again, maybe kind of, sort of. And so it turns into a great complex struggle. And so in the war's aftermath, you have in many ways a tale of two nations. You've got the victorious North. The North might not be Hercules in a cradle anymore, to borrow Alexander Hamilton's phrase. It might not be fully grown, but it's certainly beyond its adolescent stage. At the end of the war, the North has a booming economy. It's got executive power definitely clearly established and defined in the forms of Lincoln's actions and activities. It's got a stable government. It's got a million-man army that's been battle-tested. It's probably, arguably, the most effective and powerful military force on the planet at the time of Appomattox. At the end of the war, there's nothing else that can touch it in any ways. And it's also this nation that saw war industries expand. The McCormick Reaper helped generate this agricultural boom. The North is prosperous and vibrant in so many ways, even with the Copperhead faction trying to actively resist Northern efforts during the war. As for the South is a nation that's devastated by war. The South is a nation that's been brought to its knees. Utter destruction in so many levels. Numerous men injured, killed, maimed, etc., not coming back. Farmland left to rot, or crops left to rot in the field as the farms weren't harvested, or battles were being fought in those lands. Their industries laid waste to, their infrastructure shattered. So it's a region that's really, in many ways, almost set back enormously. Prior to the war, the South would have been one of the most productive countries on the world on its own. After the war, it's set back tremendously. And so you've also got now these former slaves and their former white masters, and the whites who weren't masters but who always saw slaves and blacks as being less than them, all in this population in a situation of great fluidity. The old social order and standards and rules don't seem to apply anymore, but nothing has replaced them. And so it's a very unsettled time within the South. Now the freedmen, as the ex-slaves were called, they were optimistic at first, but it's very slow going. They test their freedom. They leave their plantations. They try to find their families. They try to lose their deference and respect towards the white man, at least in terms of having to completely, be beneath whatever white claims were. But the main thing they want is land. Land would equal freedom for them because they could take care of themselves. They could feed themselves. They could be self-sufficient. And other than that, they largely want to be left alone. Other than that, they want to earn their own economic security. To assist them in this task, an agency from the war, the Freedmen's Bureau, which had the job to help ex-slaves medically, legally, socially, and educationally, it was underfinanced. I mean, for the job it had to do 4.5 million ex-slaves, it did not nearly begin to have the resources it needed. But still, it did help many, but it still came up short. It was accused of large-scale corruption, which was largely unfair and untrue. It was simply overwhelmed by the task placed before it. Now, that's at social activities at that lower level. At the national level with Reconstruction, beyond the freedmen, you've got other groups that are playing a major role here. First of all, we can start with the executive branch and presidential plans. Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction were not thoroughly fleshed out at the time of his assassination in 1865. Initially, his first trial balloons he was floating called for a 10% plan, the so-called 10% plan, where once 10% of the white males of any state re-swore their allegiance to the Union, that state could be readmitted to the Union. Radical Republicans within Congress already had seen this and didn't like it. There were those within Congress who thought Reconstruction ought to be a joint governmental effort. They resented the powers that the executive branch had assumed during the war, going beyond the normal constitutional checks and balances, and additionally felt that this was far too lenient of a plan. Northerners that said, we didn't bring this war on ourselves, the South brought it on to us, and there ought to be someone held to account for this. This kind of armed war is treason. Somebody ought to be made to pay for that, but also there ought to be true institutional and social change in the South. This would be the abolitionists, the radical Republicans, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, among the leading people of that group. In the Wade Davis bill, the so-called Ironclad Oath, they said, no. We don't want 1 out of 10 white Southerners. 50%, half of Southerners in a state population have to re-swear allegiance to the Union before we let them in. And then in between, caught in the middle, you would have had Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president who assumes the presidency after his assassination. Johnson largely wanted to be lenient and give amnesty to most except for the rich. He was anti-planter, he was pro-yeoman, he felt that he was a white senator from Tennessee. He was the only Southern senator not to give up his Senate seat, as you recall from your classes. And so as such, he was put onto the Union ticket in 1864 as Lincoln's vice president to try to attract some Democratic votes from the North. Now, Johnson's plan is initially to believe that the South largely got misled and duped into the Civil War by the old Southern plantation elite, and he resented them. He resented them and despised them and wanted to punish that old Confederate leadership. But he was pro-yeoman and wanted to let new states in, meaning the old ex-Confederate states, as soon as they accepted the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, and rejected Confederate debts. The new Southern governments that get formed in many ways are pretty defiant. The white South's fearful response is, well, first of all, most Southerners are poor at the end of the war. The issue is not necessarily what will happen to the African American population, what will happen to the entire population. And there's no more social order without slavery anymore, with emancipation. They fear equality. They fear African Americans seeking revenge. They feared what they called the Africanization of their society. So as a result, these Southern governments get formed, and they're defiant. Old ex-Confederate Southern leaders try to reassume their seats within these governments. And they don't accept the 13th Amendment. They don't allocate for black rights. And instead they pass what are called the black codes. They're attempting, the white goal overwhelmingly is to turn back the clock. They're attempting to reestablish the old order, restrict the rights of these freedmen as much as possible, make slavery without the chain, in other words, and get federal troops out of the South as quickly as possible. In many ways, then Congress, seeing these governments coming in and attempting to be reinstituted, yet not really having affected any change of fact or structure or nature, Congress looks around, without Lincoln there, who could have maybe balanced some of this, looks at Johnson and says, what are we doing? We're going to let these states in as if nothing had ever happened. They're going to just come right back into the Union like nothing had happened. Something's happened. And as a result, Congress puts together a joint committee on Reconstruction. And part of this committee's conclusions are that Congress has a role to play. Congress has a role to play within the Reconstruction of the South. It is not exclusively something that the executive branch deals with. Congress can play a role in dictating what terms are going to be allowed to allow states to rejoin the Union. And so they also push for the 14th Amendment, which says that all people born here are American citizens, and that states must not deprive any American citizen of due process of law. This is going to be a very big deal for 20th century law and things to come on civil rights and social rights and gender rights and equality, that parts of the Constitution are applied directly to the states. This is the so-called incorporation doctrine, meaning states were incorporated or fell under the authority of the Bill of Rights and could not simply deviate from those bills of rights and just do things that they wanted to do, whether federal law said it was legal or not, to treat different categories of people differently.